we start the round, the motion before us today is this House would allow employees to contractually agree with their employer to delay or forgo having children during their employment. And we call the first proposition speaker to the podium, please. Here.
Whether it's in writing or not, the question is always on the table. Are you going to be a mother? Am I going to invest in something I will not get a return on? We put it in writing, make it less insidious, and in that process, give financial autonomy to countless young female professionals. What is our stance in this debate? Two things. Firstly, what are the types of employers likely to use these clauses in their contracts or to encourage their use? A, it's smaller or medium-sized enterprises because they cannot spend that much on payroll without explicitly getting an investment back. I think larger companies can not only afford to make a loss on payroll on certain employees, especially if they're up and coming, promising, and show a lot of initiative, but more importantly, they're focused a lot on things like inclusivity, and they want to maintain a good image and have reputational incentives to do so, even if it is always not the thing that could make them the most amount of money. B, it's physical workplaces because they expect you to be there every single day. If you go on maternity leave and don't show up, that's going to be kind of a problem for them. And so therefore, remote work is probably going to be more of an open thing for women who want children on our side of the house. But C, it's companies which would have implicitly weighed this in their reasoning anyways. So they wouldn't have put it into writing, but they would have thought, okay, if I'm going to break the deadlock between a very qualified man and a very qualified woman, the way I do that is the woman is probably going to have children later on, or she just got married, or something along those lines. We force those companies to put it into writing and to expose their hiring practices. Ultimately, women who want to have children right now have ample options. In fact, certain companies become hubs for women who want to have children and still want to get hired. In the same way that certain companies, for example, this is just an analogy, focus more on employing people who have for example, autism or something along those lines. Like a certain demographic is more valued at that company and they're likely to do that. This also means that women who are going to be discriminated against anyways don't spend their time, resources, and money applying to jobs that aren't going to hire them in the first place anyways. But secondly then, we believe that contracts are of 2 to 5 years and they're often renegotiated later on. So these clauses can very much change. There's more of a consideration for early career female professionals. Two arguments then. The first, on how we give young female professionals financial autonomy, and the second, on how we give women autonomy over their bodies on our side of the house. Sure.
Why should women have to change how they live to fix inequality when efforts such as mandatory paternity leave can already do that?
Why do that? Can you repeat that?
Why should women have to change how they live and their choices to fix inequality when efforts such as mandatory paternity leave can already equal the disadvantage?
Okay, so the second part doesn't have a lot of context because you haven't given your case yet, but I can answer the first part. We do this all the time. So for instance, we would likely be able to give up our mannerisms, our autonomy, the places we live to work for the jobs that we have, and therefore this is a completely fine trade-off to make. First argument on how we give young female professionals financial autonomy. The context is simple. Women are amply discriminated against in this moment in time. If you recently gotten married or in a relationship, you could get pregnant and this weighs against you in hiring. Furthermore, young female professionals are incredibly affected by this. Managers make these decisions, but sometimes it's not even conscious. Just when employee profiles look very similar, that's the thing that you do. When you ask a question like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? That is implicitly what you are asking. When you ask a question like, oh, is it Miss or Mrs.? That is implicitly what you are asking. Note that there's a change in the trend in how women see themselves though. Firstly, more and more women want to forgo having children entirely. In modern industrial societies, this is a very sizable portion. Almost the majority of women do not want to have children throughout their lifetimes. Whether that's because they don't want to bring children into this world, or whether they just don't buy into narratives that you need to have children in order to be happy. But secondly, more women are getting married and having children on average at least 10 years later than the average was just a couple decades ago. These highly qualified women also have to find it difficult in this process and get lumped in with women who want children right now. This not only means that they're less less likely to get hired, even though they're incredibly qualified. But it also means that even if they get hired, they're less likely to get a higher paying promotion because the company is like, hey, if I give this woman more money, she's immediately going to go on maternity leave and zap up my resources anyways. We give these women an avenue on our side of the house to access financial autonomy. Firstly, women who don't want children at all intuitively are always going to be the stakeholder we win on our side of the house. And again, this is a sizable portion of women in the world right now. But secondly, women who want to have them later, they can simply work, prove their value in the company after signing this contract without having children or foregoing them for the term of that contract, so 2 to 5 years. And then they can renegotiate their contract a few years later if they really still want to have children and it wasn't just because of societal pressure. What changed in this process? A, they proved their value to the workplace and proved that they were majorly significant, perhaps with the contributions that they made, perhaps with the slides that they made, I don't know, or whatever. But B, workplaces value long-term employees. It takes a really long time to indoctrinate employees into their company values, and that's something that they value a lot. So they're not just going to let a long-term employee go just because they want to renegotiate their contract now because they want to have a children in the present, right? The principal justification for this is threefold. Number one, jobs can always stop you from moving away, how you dress, your mannerisms, whether you do overtime or not. Literally placing limits on the way you look, the way you act for most of your day, where you live, so you're like the physical space in which you can move around in. It's more fundamental to your identity, I think, than the desire for children.
Yeah.
And if you say that a desire for children is more fundamental to your identity, that's your loss, right? But secondly, people can do things to make themselves more attractive hires. So for example, if someone could not go to a very fancy university because they did not have enough money, someone can still put that fancy university on their resume and get hired over that person, and we won't vilify that person for doing so because they just made themselves an attractive hire in the current state of affairs. But thirdly, people are allowed to make certain trade-offs. For example, you can earn less but get a better healthcare plan in most companies, or you can earn more and get a worse healthcare plan. We allow people to make fundamental decisions about their lives. But second argument, how we give women autonomy over their bodies. Note that women often face familial pressures or social pressures to have children. In your family, it's like your husband suddenly brings up children 1 year into your marriage, even though you said, hey, let's wait a few years because I want to really get into my work, right? He's like, hey, children, they're so nice, aren't they? And it absolutely sinks your heart because you never expected that and you don't know where it's coming from. You can always go back to your company later. Let's just have children right now. Or it's social. Things like children can be the joy of your life, and maybe you can do it all. Have children right now and also go to your job. But children are the most important part. They will bring happiness into your life. Women often, I'll take another BOI.
Would you allow women to give up their ability to have certain hobbies or even to date just to become more employable?
The thing is, we do often give up a lot of our hobbies. For example, if our hobby is bird watching and we can only do that in the morning when our work is going on, we forego that hobby to earn financial resources in order to gain control over our life. Money is everything. When you have more money, and especially when you have more money later in life, you can regain that autonomy in various ways. But women often early career want to focus on their jobs in the present. They understand that they don't want major employment gaps that make them less attractive hires later on in their career. But furthermore, changing media influences which tell them that a mother is not all they can be, and they unveil the double standards, such as the fact that men are never told these things, are really attractive to these women. On our side of the house, number one, familial pressures are more likely to go away because your husband cannot simply say this to you because it's in your contract and he understands that. Most families actually need a double stream of income, and when it's specifically in your contract that you cannot do this, otherwise your job will be terminated, he's less likely to bring that up when you previously did not discuss it. But secondly, in terms of social pressures, we believe they're more likely to get outweighed because you don't let yourself manipulated by the narrative that you can have it all, because it is in writing now that you cannot have it all, and you couldn't have it all previously either, but now no one is lying to you about it. We are less insidious about the truth of the world. Ideally, you would be able to do everything, but you cannot do that, and we will retain whatever rights and liberties we have at the moment. Vote us.
Thank you very much for that speech. You call the first opposition speaker to the podium, please. Here.
Does any of the speakers want water? Do you guys water? Just
proposition engineers a pipeline where the womb of women becomes the factory and the battleground of whether they get jobs. On the opposition, we thought that strips women of their autonomy, and even then, that is a fundamentally principled violation of what should be allowed. We're very proud to oppose. Two arguments in his speech. The first on why this is innately, fundamentally unjustified, and the second on how this harms women to a greater degree. Before that, onto a counter setup, 3 parts. 1. What does proposition's policy look like? Note, while P1 can assert that renegotiations of contracts can exist, we would note that this may not only occurs when new contracts are signed to a brand new company, but also during contract renewals. This means that employers on their side could tell employees that this is a deal breaker if they're able to get a new contract. Or for example, that this might be the edge out of whether they get a greater bonus or whether they get a greater pay. This means that this engineers a pipeline and an infinite cycle of delaying and foregoing their reproductive rights on their side of the house. This explains why their mechanism of renegotiation is insufficient in ensuring that checks and balances or choice exists on their side. The second is that we would note that this is unlike first proposition's assertions, that is very likely used by most, if not all, companies regardless of their sizes, because we would note that all companies are innately profit incentivized. That if they're able to cost cut, if they're able to minimize their operational costs, that they will be able to do so. And notably, big corporations uniquely hire more people, which necessitates greater levels of cost cutting, which means that all companies will likely force people on their side of the house or make this a condition for hiring on their side of the house. But secondly then, what do we support? Note, on our side of the house, no thank you, employees cannot agree to forgo childbearing regardless of their will on our side. But there are 2 things I'd like to outline. The first is that there are other protection mechanisms to ensure that women get hired on our side. For example, anti-discriminatory laws that disable gender, as for instance, a disqualifier for you not being hired. But the second is that it looks like mandatory paternity leaves. Note, the implication of mandatory paternity leaves is that it puts both men and women at equal disadvantages at hiring, because it means that both of them will be able to take a leave and therefore be a less productive employee to the company, to the employers and the company on their side. The difference on both sides then is that, note, even if our counterfactual is imperfect, but it's still better than proposition, because they place the burden on employees to change their choices and alter themselves to make it themselves a more lucrative employee to the company. But it's on our side of the house that the burden is landed on the employers. Finally then, at a point of framing, we would note that Team Pakistan's conception of women in this round is remarkably shallow, because we would note that at our side we recognize that different types of women exist. Perhaps some women want children, perhaps some women do not want children. There's no statistical data to distinct what types of women exist in a majority. But even if you are a woman, for example, that do not want a children right now, the fact is you cannot decide for yourself in 5 years or in 10 years or in a short future whether you want to have a children or not, because these are innate uncontrollable factors that you don't have the ability to control. For example, whether you meet your desirable partner, for example, whether your circumstances in your life change, for example, the exposure to new information that might change your calculus of decision. Therefore, Team Pakistan needs to do more. They need to prove why opening a floodgate for people to trade off their reproductive rights for pure job opportunities is justified. We just have to prove why it is morally abhorrent. Our case is going to broadly clash the vast majority of the claims then. On our first argument as why this is justified, Team Pakistan's case is that this is justified because it's a choice that you make. So on our first argument then, we will prove why this is a violation of contractual obligations, regardless of whether this is a choice or not. The frame of this argument is that independent of societal coercion, we will argue in this argument why it is not allowed. Let's first analyze then, where do we draw the line of what is allowed to be contractually restricted? For example, we allow regulating things that affect the companies directly. For example, we don't allow a criminal to be employed. We regulate against criminal activities, and that if, for example, you have a criminal track record during your contractual period or during your contract, then that contract can be terminated. Or for example, we allow companies to set up performance metrics that if you don't meet a certain KPI, then that contract termination is possible. But note, all of these are independent of your identity and personal affairs. So the line that is drawn here is that companies will not have the ability to infringe on your personal affairs and your personal personal identity when it comes to contractual restriction. This means that the proposition, therefore, this is the metric of what is allowed to be drawn in a contract or not. We draw parallels to the status quo. The companies are not allowed to control on a personal life like your relationships, like whether you get married, or for example, they don't prohibit you from taking out external jobs or more jobs than your current one. How does proposition therefore tip this line and violate this by allowing employees to surrender their rights? The first we would note is that reproductive rights are an integral part of your identity that companies ought not police. These are rights that you can make for yourself. But a second is that coexistence between having a child and being a professional worker is not mutually exclusive. So for example, we have tons of mothers out there who could still work professionally despite raising a child. You could externalize child raising to for example, kindergartens or for example, other nannies. The point is, all these are personal choices that Team Pakistan has no ability to impede upon. What end is the impact of this violation in two ways? The first is that morally we would note that this is a targeted attack on certain groups of people, specifically women on their side. This is akin to targeting racial minorities, telling them they could just surrender their identity, their skin color, their accent to get a job. Even if, for example, this might be a justified choice in a vacuum, the point is, we as a government and a society are not permit this. But the second only practical implication that you engineer a slippery slope for employers to cross the line even further and even more on their side. And this comes in two ways. The first is, again, principally and morally, that this is incredibly abhorrent because you allow companies to be dictatorial over the choices of their employees. For example, telling them you cannot get married because you're in a job, telling you that you cannot pursue certain hobbies and activities. This is akin to stripping individuals of their dignity and their rights. But more importantly, specifically for reproductive rights, this is irreversible because women have limited time frames of being optimal in childbearing. That, for example, if you pass the age of 35, childbearing becomes immensely more high risk, which is why this restriction is unjustified. Before that, yes.
Your only response to our idea that these women won't be hired anyways is that paternity leave also exists. That's like a couple of weeks or months at the most. Maternity leave can go up to 1 to 2 years. It's very different.
So first of all, that still mitigates your case to a significant degree. But second is, we now argue why this is fundamentally unjustified. Hence, even if society is equally as coercive, we will analyze in a second argument why this gets worse. But the second and more importantly is that the implication of this argument is that it still practically extends to its other activities that companies can pursue, and that is a very dangerous slippery slope that Team Malaysia ought not stand with. Second argument then on why this impedes of women. Uniquely, we would note that this is very coercive because if you listen to the rhetoric of Team Pakistan, that this is incredibly beneficial for companies, that this is the best way for them to expand themselves. And more importantly, on women's end, you very likely engineer self and internalized coercion, that you create a race to the bottom. If you don't sacrifice your reproductive rights, or if you don't forgo your ability to childbear, then you very likely will not get a contract. Even if this is not realistic, the point is there's an engineered conception on their side that coerces women to not do so. The harm of this argument is simple. Perhaps some women might not want to have a child, but most women still hold the potentiality to want to have a child in the future. And we would note that the difference in this round is that the people who want to have children are significantly more vulnerable because society condemns them to no alternatives on their world.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call the second speaker of proposition to the podium, please. Here.
Am I ready to start? Beginning in 3, 2, 1. as a woman who doesn't want to have a child, you are grouped together with a gender association that you might want to have a child, so I'm not going to hire you because some other women in this interview did want to, and therefore I'm going to group you together and not going to hire you either. That is the defense, that is the thing that opposition has to defend within this debate. I want to notice I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, the distinction about how many women are being hired and how it affects those women specifically who don't want to have children. Secondly, is it justified for companies to make decisions about your personal life? And thirdly, an extension on Ali's second line of argument. Firstly then, on the distinction about not being hired at all. On their side of the house, they have to defend that there's a very small amount of women who are abducted into the workforce. Sure, in developed nations, there's a few more, but in the third world specifically, there's not a lot of women that are part of the workforce, at least not in the formal sector. They don't get paid high amounts, and this is an exponentially larger amount than men who are in the workforce. But also notice that the reason that they don't get hired is because corporations are scared of maternity leave and not having a return on investment, etc., because of a few women who might still want to have children. Ali already characterizes to you that the largest amount of women are moving away from having children or the expectation to do so, because they recognize that it's not the only thing that gives them satisfaction or joy within this. They assert that no, this is not true, but statistically it is. Less children are being born, less women want to get married earlier, less women want to have children earlier. This is all to say that women generally want financial freedom, generally want to move towards their career more and more and become more financially independent. The problem is that corporations still function in outdated gender associations that you might want to have a child, because some women still do. The point is, these women are specifically grouped together with those who don't want it at all. And the problem with this is that you don't get hired at all. So all of the benefits that they talk about, that hey, later you won't be able to have a child, etc., all come at the cost of not having a job for the vast majority of women in the first place. And why does this actor uniquely weigh out over theirs? Because notice, their age is far larger in scale. So most women, even if they want to have children, don't want to have them at the age of 20 when they're trying to get into the workforce, not even at the age of 25. Probably 30, 35 is where more people are starting to go towards. But on their side of the house, those people don't get a job that is well paying in the first place. But secondly, and more importantly, these are people who are unfairly discriminated against. So sure, we agree that all women are. But the point is, corporations always have a justification to not employ people who want to have kids, which is to say that we won't get a return on investment. This is something that we expect to happen in the first place. But women who don't want to have kids anyways, this unfair burden is propagated onto them. Because even when they don't want to have children, they're set to the same standard. And those people are unfairly not hired during the process of interviews, etc., etc. Secondly, on the idea of is it unjustified for corporations to have this contractual obligation, etc., I want you to notice that most of opposition's argumentation falls in the category that corporations are going to force you to sign this contract in the first place. This is not true. Ali gives you a bunch of characterization about how specific corporations are out of this debate for the reasons, for example, that they're remote, so it doesn't require you to be there in a physical capacity, or the fact that they have the ability and the abundance of funds to be able to give people maternity leave, etc. And their response to this is, hey, they hire a bunch of people, so therefore it's not cost effective. Okay, they hire a bunch of people, but they make exponentially larger amounts of profit. The same analysis still applies. They're able to hire a bunch of people, they're still able to have costs, and still able to incur costs of maternity leave, because the fact that they want to prioritize their PR and reputation, which is really, really important for firms that are really large. So for instance, Google, making more communal surroundings within their corporate spaces because they want to seem like a more employee-friendly workplace. Stuff like that is something that larger corporations generally prioritize. So we don't think this is a forced decision in the first place. But they say, hey, that even if it's not forced, they shouldn't have the ability to dictate who you marry, who you date, etc. I want you to notice what the terms of a contract are. That they need to be cognizant of mutual effects on both parties. The person that you're marrying or the person that you're dating has absolutely no link to your job. It has no link to your employer in the first place. It doesn't make a difference to them, their lives, or their corporations, or the amount of money that they make. The ability to have a child, though, or a child that you do end up having and taking maternity leave for 2 years, no matter how discriminatory it is, it does have an effect on your job. It doesn't have an effect on the company. Therefore, this is something that is distinct from the person that you're marrying or the person that you're dating or the religion that you have. Stuff like that is very, very distinct. At that point in time, notice that there's a mutual contract, which is to say that it affects both parties. So for instance, even when you are a mother or a parent, your job directly impacts that. So your ability to, how many hours you have to spend with your child in the first place. These are things that are dictated by both parties and not just the parents. This is to say that this has to be part of your contractual obligation because it's something that is mutual in itself. But more importantly, I want you to notice that even if they say that this is the part of your personal life that corporations shouldn't engage with, the problem is we do that all the time anyway. So their own POI about hobbies and identity shoots them in their own foot, because yes, we give up our hobbies all the time. We give up the places that we live in, the communities that we belong to move to other places that may give us better paying jobs. We leave all of that behind. We leave behind our families. We leave behind our willingness to have a culture that will be connected to us. We leave behind our ability to have free time and do things that we genuinely enjoy, because we enslave ourselves in a contract that buys sacrifice our time. We give up our rights, we give up our freedoms all the time just to seem as a more attractive hirer. And we do this because jobs give us exponentially larger benefits than any of those things, and this is something that I'll prove to you in a second, sure.
So your side creates a race to the bottom where if you don't surrender your reproductive rights, very likely you'll be outcompeted by other women, which again takes away choice. So which side is the side?
I want you to notice one thing. Number one, women who generally prioritize their reproductive rights at younger ages aren't hired at all. So if you're just a newly married person at 20 years or you're having a child at 25, you're not going to get hired on either side of the house. The problem here is the people who don't want to have children are not hired on your side either because they have no ability to formalize that and say, I don't want to be part of this. But secondly, this is an assertion that every company will force you to do this. We tell you there's a bunch of companies who don't want to do this, you can still go to those. But more importantly, you can have children later on. This is the last part of my speech in itself, which is an extension on Ali's second line of argument. The fact is that Ali tells you that people tell you can do it all, but most women cannot because they're not able to do so at a time when they specifically get into the hiring industry or get in the job industry. Why is this different from when you start out versus when you have a stable job in the first place? Because notice, when you generally start out, you do things to impress your boss more, so you're willing to put in more hours, work overtime for less compensation. You do things like take lower paying jobs because you know that you probably wouldn't get a higher paying job at the current status that you are in. Notice this is very, very distinct from when you're stable, established, and have a well-paying job in the future. Because later, you've proven your credibility. You've proven that you're an employee that is worth keeping. You have more money to be able to support your family in the first place anyways. In fact, we think that more women should wait to have more children. And this is something that people are generally going towards because this formalization, this acts as a formal counter-narrative to the already existing societal push that women should have children earlier and earlier. And women want to shift away from that. And this is another step that we're allowing them to do that. We think that money is far more important and women should wait for a couple of reasons. And money is more important than kids specifically. Why so? Because you require money for your literal survival. The ability to put food on your table, to access healthcare, to access any sort of benefit, to be able to live in itself, you need money in the first place. And they might say, hey, this is a coerced decision, but you do things out of survival all the time. So for instance, eating food or going to the hospital is also a coerced decision to survive, but you have to do it because you need to live. This is different from having a child because all they provide to you might be some sort of emotional fulfillment, but not actual physical survival. Secondly, and more importantly, we think you need money to have a family in the first place anyway. So if you have a lower paying job, you probably won't be able to support having a child in the first place because you're not able to afford daycare, etc., etc. But thirdly, we think money gives you financial freedom and autonomy specifically from men as a woman, and this is super important because money is a way to make your identity and not be exploited by somebody who has complete power and control over all the decision making of your life. Children aren't able to do this. In fact, they entrench you within the same power structures of being attached to a man in the first place. You're not able to explore your identity outside of familial structures. We think therefore money is far more important. Even if opposition is able to prove that both of these are coercive in nature, that both decisions to have a child and to have a job are coercive and you're taking away rights on either side of the house, just weigh this on the fact of where you have more benefits, which is to say that money is the thing you need for survival, children are not. Based on that, give it to Pakistan.
We remind the speakers on the bench to please speak a little bit more quietly. It can be a little bit distracting for the judges. And we call the second opposition speaker to the podium. Here to
My mother is a working woman. She had her first child at the age of 26. Today, she is the reason why I'm able to come here. Today, she is the reason why I've been able to live a good life. But the reality is that proposition would have my mother not be a worker at all. They would have locked her out of these systems because they would have forced her to make an impossible choice, to change my identity and the way I want to live my life or to regain financial autonomy. Three things in my speech then. Firstly, a quick rebuttal on financial autonomy, and then a first issue on choice, and secondly, on justification. Let's quickly deal and frame out their argument on financial autonomy, because the reality is that Proposition's argument on financial autonomy is premised on two things. Number one, that women who are going to get hired will somehow rise to the top of the career ladder and be able to escape all other forms of workplace discrimination. We think there are many other things that impose a glass ceiling onto women's ability to regain financial autonomy. We don't think that works. But secondly, the argument on financial autonomy does not weigh out over the largest claims in this debate, because the largest harm coming from opposition was that not that women couldn't get jobs. The largest harm coming from opposition is that Proposition reverses any effort to get women into the workplace in equal and fair places in the first place, because you force women to take that unfair burden, force women to take a burden that men never had to take, and that was what reversed equality. Two things then. Firstly, on choice. And here is where I want to point out the nuance in this debate. Because Proposition is not defending choice when they in contractual obligations transforms what should be a personal choice into a professional cage. There are three things in this issue. Firstly, I want to make a quick observation that they cannot run a case where the contracts and the clause of not having a child can be renegotiated in the future. The reason why this is true is because they analyze it for us. They tell you that when it comes to having women in the workplace, having a child is a deal breaker. That applies at any age, no matter what stage in the corporation or the corporate ladder you're on. Because if you are an indisposable worker and you take leave for 2-3 years because you wanted maternity leave, that in itself was going to become an even bigger harm to the company's bottom line. But secondly, that most women and employees are not indisposable. Most people don't become CEOs who have the ability to renegotiate. Insofar as they can always replace you with somebody else who is willing to not have kids and who is willing to extend the clause of that contract, you would lose your job. But lastly, even if women could become indisposable, we think it takes far longer than they say it does. Because they tell you that fine, even if I don't have kids at 25, I could have it at 35 or at 40. But the reality is, panel, that climbing the corporate ladder takes far longer than that. Most people don't become indisposable by the time they're 35 or 45. But what most women do become after the age of 40 is that they lose the ability to have children in ways that are safe for their body. They lose the ability to take care of children because as they grow old, they grow more tired and they can't spend as much time with their children. That was the irreversible harm that Proposition never dealt with. So if this metric was on irreversibility panel, it was clear it went to opposition. But secondly, on the idea of coercion that they don't respond to, because their flippant response to coercion is that you are coerced anyway into doing these things. I want to point out that coercion exists for 3 reasons, and it's specifically horrible because it's targeted at women. Number one is that there is a punishment for not complying with the contractual obligations. That is to say, if you opt out, you lose your job. That is not a choice, that is forcing people into a rock and a hard place. But secondly is that there was a race to the bottom. If you didn't take up this clause and you didn't extend this clause, someone else will. But lastly, there was power asymmetry. For all the arguments you made about financial autonomy, that explained to us why the company had more leverage over women. That is the reason why that they could not make the choice fairly. But sure.
On your side of the house, just by virtue of the fact that you have the ability to reproduce, you are discriminated on that. On our side of the house, at least people who want to opt into that right are not discriminated.
This brings me to the third thing then, on what happens. Because Proposition says that companies are always implicitly going to ask women to not have children. We think this doesn't matter in the round for 2 reasons. Firstly, is that it can be mitigated. Our model explains this to you. They say, oh, but maternity leave is longer. Panel, the whole point of the model was that we had equal paternity leave. That was what was enforced in Europe. Please look up more facts to back your case. But secondly, was that even if we didn't have a perfect model panel, the point was that in the interview process itself, we don't see why you can't lie. Because at the very worst case, you don't have a contractual obligation. They ask you, do you plan to have kids? You say, oh, in the next 5 years, I don't think I will. But the point is that you can reverse that decision. You are contractually obligated on a proposition to not reverse that decision. So even if I make the personal choice during hiring on side of opposition, the metric was reversibility and who had leverage and who was held to the terms of a contract. That was why women who don't want to have kids could still benefit on the side of opposition. obligation. But the weighing is this versus the women who do want to have kids, who do want to have the ability to have children. We think it's far more important to prioritize these stakeholders then, because in this debate, if you had to prioritize two choices, one could be mitigated and one could still escape the largest harm by simply lying and then taking back that lie later when you're not contractually obligated. But the other side of the debate had their choices completely taken away from them forever because of how society created an obligation and imposed expectations on them to take up an unfair contractual term. The second issue in this debate then is on what was actually the principled justification, because proposition's responses are flippant. They tell you that the only reason why this is a fair justification is because having a child would directly affect your job. They say that relationships don't. Panel, let's really think about this. How true is it that all other things in my personal life don't affect my job? If I got a boyfriend and he broke up with me and cheated on me, I'd be so emotionally distressed that I couldn't perform to my best ability and I couldn't meet my key performance index, which means that I can't get a promotion. If that in itself was the ability to affect my performance, if they say everything that has the ability to affect your performance should be able to be written in contract, they need to control every aspect of your personal life, not just your ability to reproduce. But secondly, I want to examine the truth of the statement that having a child has an effect on your job, because we don't think that there is a clear and direct correlation, because it's not true, right? You can have a child and you can still perform at work. The point is that maybe you are not performing at your optimal, but you are meeting your minimal professional obligations. That is to say, you are showing up at work, you are hiring a nanny, you're getting your mother or your grandmother to help take care of your child for you. There are many other ways to circumvent this. Insofar, the inherent choice of having a child does not directly impede on your ability to perform at work. We don't think that metric holds up at all. But lastly, panel, even if it was true and we accepted the metric, we said, sure, we agree that having a child has an effect on your job. We agree that companies should be able to decide what has an effect on your job and contractually write it into terms. It was still an unfair imposition on women because this was targeted discrimination. This was targeted discrimination and only going to go towards women. You would not ask men to sign this contract because employers would never expect this from men. The point then here is that if you impose burdens onto women to adapt to inequality instead of fixing it, you get rid of all of our mechanisms, because the comparative can only exist on the side of opposition. When you create the norm that it is society that has to fix itself and not women that have to change the way they act so that they're able to exist in an unfair society. At the end of this debate, two things are clear. Firstly, that we prioritize larger society and larger groups of people in opposition, and that alone itself should be able to win this debate. But secondly, if this debate was about protecting women, then I want to ask this proposition. Why then do you put the burden on solving inequality on the individual instead of the people who perpetuate it themselves?
We again remind the speakers on the bench to please keep it quiet because it can be very distracting for the judges, and we call the third proposition speakers on podium
Stopwatch, please. Two things in this speech. First, on financial autonomy. Second, on choice in your personal life. Firstly, on financial autonomy. The first claim we get here from side opposition is that mothers get locked out and don't get any jobs. The first thing I want to say to this is that women who are mothers are actively less in the work field for two reasons. Number one, because we already specify that women want to have children later and later in life. This is because you want a stable financial base when you want those children. But secondly, we also just say that women who are mothers just probably want to work less. Why? Because probably they have a lot more time catering for their child. Probably you have familial pressures telling you not to work, stuff like that. This means that women who are mothers are a smaller population of this debate. What we allow three things for them. Firstly, you probably have some female-dominated industries that exist on either side of the house. Things like nursing, etc., where you have a lot of female labor unions, where you have some amount of, for example, accountability for these companies. There, if you're already hiring like 100 women, you're probably going to have some women on maternity leave on either side of the house. Second, we say big corporations are not as relevant part of this debate because we say big corporations have such certain certain social pressures, which means that they might give some extent of maternity leave on either side of the house. Their response is, well, big companies have a profit incentive. Let's weigh both incentives. Big companies have a profit incentive, yes, but they're already making a lot of profit. In this particular context then, social pressure becomes a lot more important, because if you have a lot of social pressure, people boycott your firm, they stop buying, this can severely cut into your profits. So it's a lot more riskier to, for example, compromise on social pressure in this instance, which means I'll show you of the profit incentive, the social pressure weighs over, which means there's some extent of maternity leave there as well. But thirdly, the remote work alternative was never engaged with. This means mothers still get options on our side of the house, and I don't think that's particularly relevant either. What is in the context of this debate? We say in a lot of different companies, especially in smaller companies, there is too much downside of maternity leave. For example, you lose a lot of efficiency, you lose profits because you have to pay extra money, especially for small companies where each person matters, where team projects can be screwed up. You choose not to hire women, you choose because of the maternity leave concept. They say, well, we can just model in paternity leave and have it be the exact same. Firstly, no. According to WSDC rules, you can only use the exact amount of political capital that exists on our side of the house. Paternity leave and equalizing it to maternity leave has virtually zero political capital in the entire world. You cannot just generate this entire political capital. You do not have the fiat. Stop badgering. The second thing I want to note here is that in terms of paternity leave, I think that fundamentally it's just less time, right? Because of the fact that like mothers fundamentally are affected more. So paternity leave is always going to be more in terms of quantity. But even if it's not, in their absolute best case, you still perceive maternity leave in a greater fashion, i.e. people still have that bias that mothers are going to take more time off, that they're going to be pregnant, so they might be physically like less able to do that job, they're going to be stressed, stiff, stuff like that. So even if you have equal paternity leave on their side of the house, this does not equate it. So this means women are still disadvantaged on their side of the house. So I think at that point in time, that still exists. But also lastly on paternity leave. Paternity leave is less and less accessible, especially in developing countries. You might have some extent of maternity leave, but paternity leave is relatively absent. This means some women might be hired on either side of the house that are very, very good. So if you're able to show a lot of return, a company might still hire you, but this means that the broader population of women are less hired. But secondly, you get less permanent contracts. What does this mean? This means that, for example, companies don't want to give you long-term contracts. They give you, for example, 1 to 2 year contracts, stuff like that, because of the fact that there's a higher risk of committing. This means their mechanism on lying doesn't work. Why? Because if the company gives you a smaller contract on their side of the house, if you just lie to them, the company can probably opt out of that contract a lot quicker. But secondly, the reason why lying doesn't work is because it's really, really uncertain. The company's probably not going to believe you. If you're a 21-year-old with a boyfriend and you show up to the company, they're probably just going to be like, no, we don't believe you. But more importantly, the contract is a lot more certain on our side of the house that, for example, this is not going to happen. So I think their lying mechanism just fails at this point in time. Their second mechanism is that we have laws, but laws don't work. Why? Because proving direct causation is very, very difficult. So a company can say 10 different reasons for why they did not hire that woman. You can say that, oh, you didn't hire this woman because of the fact that she was a woman, but they can say, no, we didn't hire that woman because, I don't know, she went to a bad university or stuff like that. There's always reasons companies can give. In the context, women are already very powerless. It's very difficult that these worker laws actually matter. But secondly, worker laws are inexclusive. On our side of the house, they still exist. The difference is that at least we allow this as an additional means for women to get access. What is the comparative? Number one, we allow women to have certainty. You can give an employer a contractual record that you will stay with the company, you won't have children. Second, the employer perceives this as more committal. Think about this, right? If you say that you will not have children, the company likely thinks that you're valuing that company a lot more. They probably think you're going to give a lot more return to that company, so you're likely to be hired. The third thing I want to say is that you also gain a greater amount of bargaining chip. Because you're making this big decision, you can probably marginally increase your wages as well. Why is this better? This is better because A, you just get in the door a lot more. This is to say, you just get more jobs on our side of the house. Second, it's more likely that you access promotion. We completely agree with second opposition. Lots of glass ceilings exist, but on our side of the house, at least you have some scope of opportunity to get a promotion. The reason why is because your company does not think that you might eventually leave one day because you're having children. That also exists. So I think fundamentally we just get more access to that. Weigh this on a few different things. Number one, you can renegotiate in the long term. They say this doesn't work because the fact that your job is just going to say no. Firstly, you have a lot more work experience. This means you can probably leave your job and get another job. This means you get more leverage in the equation. Second, all companies want less labor turnover, so the competition mechanism does not work because you don't want to hire another person. You want the person who's already in your firm, who knows your company ideals, stuff like that. But thirdly, you've likely shown that you are somewhat of a valuable asset. Yes, you may not have climbed to the top, but it's comparatively more likely that you get scope to negotiate. This means it's not irreversible. We're not talking about 50-year contracts. We're talking about 5-year contracts. You can still have children when you're 30. Secondly, we just say money is a lot more certain. You get a certain amount of cushion, security that you can have for all of your life. A child does not give you that same benefit. And think about this in the logical priority sense. If you have a child without money, you can probably less able to parent that child. You can't get them nannies. You can't get them daycare. That's going to be a worse experience for you. On our side of the house, with money, you can have a better relationship with your child. Parenting is a far more meaningful experience. Second, let's talk about personal life and the principle. They say the principle is you can't encroach on people's personal life. Number one, we already say you do. So for example, you encroach on people's freedom of movement. Second, I think the choice is with you. As far as I prove that other options exist, I've also proven that choice exists. It means the coercion mechanism doesn't work. This means this principle also doesn't work. This choice is with you. The company isn't doing this. The second claim they make is that this is a slippery slope, guys, and this is really, really bad. Before I refute that, sure.
If we allow women to have to change their choices to fix inequality, would you also expect women to perform even more than men so that they're able to get equal pay?
God, I hate principles. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that inequality exists. We're not expecting women to do anything. We're just benefiting them by our model. This is not how it works, guys. This is a practical argument. You can't refute it with the principle. Moving on. Okay, the problem with the slippery slope argument is, first of all, if you take away all your workers' hobbies, then workers are naturally going to get demotivated. This means you don't have an incentive to do this because you have an incentive to keep your workers motivated. They're not going to take away your relationships or stuff like that because you'll be a soulless employee. Companies don't want this. But secondly, look, right, this is about passing laws. Even if companies have an incentive to do this, they needed to prove how the slippery slope influences parliament, because parliament might still not pass that law because you might not get political capital or stuff like that. They needed to prove how that political capital generates. Thirdly, we say people are socialized to only give up liberties if they encroach on your work. At the point at which the relationship does not encroach on your work, they say it does encroach on your work, but the person doesn't think it encroaches on your work. So people are more likely to protest these kinds of policies. They're likely to be like, what are you doing? You're policing my body. You're policing my relationship, stuff like that. This doesn't mean that slippery slope argument is very unlikely, doesn't work. On our side of the house, you have at least some amount of choice to do work or go to your personal life. For all those reasons, propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call the third speaker of opposition to the podium, please. Here, here.
Two clarifications at the top of this speech to clear up the messiness of Team Pakistan's case. Firstly, let me simplify the debate for you. Pakistan tries to box out certain corporations out, certain women into certain jobs and certain fields and how women operate. They tell you that women who want to have kids are also co-opted on their side because they can work as nurses, they can work at kindergarten with children with special needs, they can work as teachers. They tell you that debate is also prevalent in SMEs because you can work in a large corporation if you want to have a child because they can absorb the cost anyways. And lastly, they tell you that in the worst case, you can renegotiate when you get better in the company and therefore you can take away the terms that you initially negotiated. I will help you navigate why these boxes are incredibly confusing, because all of the boxes that Pakistan concedes was precisely the harm of our case. Why was it that mothers and aspiring mothers have to only take on the caretaker role in society and within their family? In their family, they are placed in caretaker roles. Team Pakistan wants them to work as nurses, as teachers, as kindergarten people. Why is it that aspiring mothers have to go the extra mile, have the extra burden to find more credentials, to work in a competitive big company because the SME will reject them otherwise? Why is it that women have to get better at their job just for more autonomy to renegotiate later when men were never given that option to begin with from the start, when men were never held to the same standards? Why is it was that extra burden put in Team Pakistan's case? Every single one of their boxes from setup, amplified, and third speaker was exactly why that was harmful. I will answer why was that really bad. We tell you it should not be this way. Team Pakistan is a perfect example of limiting the autonomy of women. We rose above that because we conceded. We told you that choice by the culture that you perpetuated was never one that was okay, and that's exactly why on their side of the house we do not defend that. We concede that they can opt into that maybe, but that coercion or the societal culture that you create and manufacture to make them choose that was exactly the harm that we pushed towards since first. On the second clarification though, they tell you that, which is probably their POI later, that well, in the worst case you're already discriminated anyways. What they do is give you the extra legwork to rise above that. My response is that if they were really already discriminated, the question is therefore not to cement it, which is what they do on their side of the house. If they're already discriminated, you do not cement it by locking out their choices and tell you that this was their choice to begin with. You do not change their entire life plans for generations and make them say that women have to opt into this in order for them to succeed. If they were already discriminated, our response was from, you should never put the onus on victims to overcome that to get some sort of effectivity. It was on our side of the house where we tell you that top-down change was what we really preferred. Before I move to towards the issue though, I'll take the POI.
You guys have tons of rhetoric, but give me a single mechanism as to how you actually improve the financial situation of women.
Right. I think at worst in this speech, I will prove as to why your implication to society still outweighs the marginal financial benefit that you may get towards the few amount of women on your side of the house. But I think at worst, our benefits and our mechanisms from first already prove as to why there are counter setups and counter alternatives that are on the trajectory towards improvement to get those financial alleviation. All of these alternatives disprove the reason why you need to justify such a radical shift on Team Pakistan's case. Insofar as the opposition proves that there is some form of alternatives, there's no reason why we needed their motion to begin with. On the issue, therefore, on the implication to society, I would like to point out that this issue rises above the confusion of the debate because it rises above the narrow view that Team Pakistan has in this round. At best, also crucial evidentiary in the POI that they only want to provide avenues to individual young workers to access jobs. But this does not account for the other women who are affected by the culture ad infinitum. This is a non-response. Their POI trades this off. They have no legwork to our entire first argument from our speech. How do we weigh this clash then? There are three things under this. Firstly, on vulnerability, we tell you that women who could rise above and get a job on their side of the house are likely those who are likely less in scale or those who are generally privileged, because these are people who can bypass other forms of discrimination, other forms of misogynistic structures, get enough credentials to beat a man, then are benefited by Pakistan's motion. These are at best, I think, on scale less in terms of vulnerability. But on our side of the house, the other women who did not consent to these other contracts being signed, did not consent to the new implication Pakistan puts on the mothers, they have no fallback. They're the largest victim of the patriarchy because they're the ones submitting to it or even wanted it to begin with. They have no protection mechanisms because they traded off. I think these were likely the women who are forced to live with the fact that their identity to want to have a child will be spat on. To have a daughter that has your eyes and laugh is one that will be used against you. I'm unsure why these women have to be forced to choose jobs that did not require physical labor, just work in kindergarten facilities. That's exactly why on your side of the house, on vulnerability, we ought not trade these individuals off. But secondly, on irreversibility, I think at worst, the access to jobs or the lack of access can be reversed through other avenues. If you really wanted a job later on in your life, you can take up skills, earn a degree. If discrimination was the problem, there were other avenues that we told you since first that were just very loosely responded to by saying it doesn't really exist, even though factual examples in the status quo has proved that we're on the trajectory towards that. That is why on their best case, they're access to their benefits was one that can be also get on our side of the house. But on our side though, the societal implications you put on these women transcends generations. You see that mothers are mothers will only be beneficial and seen as weak, and will only be carried through the family units that you impose on your side of the house. As men laugh and rise up for their 8 a.m. rise for work, the grandmother is still stuck babysitting her grandchild on their side. That is why on their side of the house, I'm unsure as to why the irreversibility of this new societal claim is one that we had to stand for. But third point of weighing, that at worst, if the individual really mattered in this round, the setup on our side gave you plausible alternatives to believe as to why we can get that benefit as well. We told you examples of equal paternity leave or anti-discrimination laws, so on and so forth. But if you don't believe those are enough, even though we've proven to them why is it structurally okay on our side of the house, only on our side do we unlock the ability to improve them. When society liberalizes via other forces, or when the onus is therefore put on the government or employers to make childcare coexist with work, to make better family planning, to have well-fed, better-for childcare, you make women coexist on the same stand organically via our side, via equity. On their side of the house, when you lock it out, you cannot have any of these alternatives, and you place the onus on the women to rise up. On our side, we have alternatives, and if you don't buy them, we can improve them exclusively. Therefore, we've proven all the other alternatives, all the other harms that Pakistan manifests through their case. There is no reason absolutely why the positive and negative case stood. Therefore, at the end of this clash, I've proven as to why the society ought to outweigh their only stakeholder in this round. But if that one stakeholder was really important, we told you there were ways in which we get them better benefits on our side. On the second issue, though, to the implication to the single individual, this is where I navigate away from the society clash, and why even on their very best case where they benefit the single mother or the single woman who wants to get the aspiring job, we tell you that that choice was still one that was coercive. And this was all independent mechanisms that were not responded to on our side of the house. We tell you that it's likely coercive because the culture in which you put is that you have to declare every single one of your family planning, and you internalize the idea that you're no longer strong if you ever had the idea that you want to have a child. This also creates a race to the bottom amongst companies where you have to make sure that you have all of these mechanisms in order to be the most productive. That means on their side of the house, within the power asymmetry that you cement within the companies, that is when people, even if they opt into your mechanism on their side, was coerced into that choice, and we think even at best, that choice was never one that was valid. For all those reasons and more, for women, side with up.
Thank you very much for that speech. You called the reply speaker of the opposition to close the opposition side of the house. Thank you.
I want to talk about two things in this speech. First, on choice, and second, on benefiting women. First, on choice. And I want to start by positioning this issue as to why, and explaining why this is the most round decisive issue, which is that all of your benefits on employment, that we can concede that perhaps women get more financial empowerment under their side of the house, but we characterize to a unique nuance from birth. That note, empowerment for women comes in a versatility of different ways, that perhaps some women might want money, perhaps some women might want to bear a child. The point is that that is only valuable, be it money or childbearing, insofar that it is a choice that is made by women. So which is why our clash on choice comes prior to all of our benefits on financial empowerment. But second, note, their clash in financial empowerment is speculative at best, as we pointed out in second and third opposition, because they at best prove that we get jobs. But we question in second to no response from our third speech, what happens after we get that job? We pointed out there are structural issues and structural corporate structures that you cannot overcome on their side of the house after you get a job. For example, you still might get fired. For example, you still might be discriminated against that job and you don't want that job. So given that then, why does choice decrease on their side? One, we pointed out I want to first point out that their analysis on why this round is exclusively about small and mid-sized corporations who lack financial stability is the exact reason why they will very likely include this clause in every single one of their employment, or implicitly hint that if you don't include this, if you don't make yourself forgo your ability to bear a child, then that you will not get employed. But second, we pointed out that the internalized coerciveness of employees, which creates a race to the bottom, that you might think that if you don't give up your reproductive rights, you will not get a job as a result. This means that choice on that decreases on their side. So let's weigh then on which side of the house do you hurt choice more. Let's compare the women who want money on their side versus the women who want children on our side. We broke this dialogue in two ways. The first is, we explained that a woman who wanted children was far more vulnerable because presumably, if these women who still want women under the current landscape of society, they're the ones who are influenced by the patriarchy to the greatest degree. They're the people who are brainwashed and indoctrinated by the patriarchal structures to the greatest extent, which is why our women matter more. But second, we note that even for the women who didn't want children right now, we explained since first that it's very speculative on whether you will want children in the future. We explained that whether you want children or not is not contingent on whatever statistics the Team Pakistan portrays, but rather is on a series of unpredictable factors in the likes of whether you meet your soulmate, for example. It's on exposure to information. The point is, the older you get, the perception might change. So this means that choice on that increases on our side, and even if they get financial empowerment on their side, there was coerced financial empowerment that women never wanted. Second then, is this choice actually justified? We already explained this is not justified because it came at the expense of vulnerable women who are brainwashed by the patriarchy, who have significantly less choices, which is why we already won the round. Second question in terms of benefiting women. The only argument they have was on financial autonomy, and they explain why they unlocked that on their side of the house. I want to first point out that every single time they explain why this debate is exclusively about mid-sized companies is every single time they undercut their own clash about women being able to access employment, because presumably big corporations are the people who employ the most amount of people, and if this debate is only about mid-sized corporations, then they're stringing their own benefit as well. But second, they were ignorant of the responses we give you in second, as what I pointed out, which is that it is unclear why getting a job means financial stability or financial autonomy on their side of the house. Presumably their internal structures that are still ingrained in a patriarchy, that you're still discriminated when you're doing your job, for example, which increases your chances of being fired on their side. The third was, even if we conceded that perhaps women get more employment on their side of the house, we explained that this clash ought not matter in this round, per the counterfactual we highlight in first, that there are some levels of mitigation, for example, just anti-discriminatory laws and the presence of paternity leaves that prohibit and increase the equality of hiring on their side. Ultimately, this round was about choice. Team Pakistan's failure was in deciding for women what they wanted.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call the reply speaker of proposition to close this debate as a whole. Thank you.
Can I start? Starting in 3, 2, 1. If you inspect their case, it genuinely comes down to it's unfair to discriminate against women who want children. Let's say, sure. The problem is, they already do that on either side of the house. But the bigger problem is that other than complaining, they have no actual mechanism to solve this, because women who want children will not get hired on their side of the house in the first place. What is the response to this? Absolutely nothing. They cannot be a team that wins on this, because they say, should women have to work harder than men? They shouldn't, but they have to, and they do, because that's the only mechanism as to how inequality gets solved. You don't provide an alternative, and insofar as you don't provide an effective alternative, ours is the only option that exists. Even if it's horrible, even if it's morally bad, or even if it's unfair, it's the only thing that gets women out of that system in the first place, and they don't engage with this. They never also engage with, by the way, the main stakeholder that we've pushed across bench, which is to say women who don't want children but are still unfairly discriminated against. This is the vast majority of people, largest on scale, but also unfairly associated with gender associations that they don't buy into. The fact that they have reproductive abilities does not mean they're buying into those reproductive abilities. Something we've said again and again and again. To assume that they will and then discriminate on those bases, it's far, far worse. Again, they never engage with the debate that actually happens, just assert rhetoric again and again. Check your notes, they can't win on anything. Aside from just rhetoric, what does opposition actually try to prove on practical? One, they say you have anti-discrimination laws. Firstly, it's inexclusive because it can happen on either side. So if the benefits are as large, then anti-discrimination laws still apply here. But more importantly, on their side of the house, anti-discrimination laws do not work. And we told you this at third specifically. The fact is that you cannot prove causality of why you did not hire this woman. Maybe she didn't go to the best university, or maybe she didn't know the language that you needed for the specific job. All of those things still exist and they cannot do anything. Versus, if you say that I do not want to have children, this is contractually obligated, you can find a job that will probably hire you regardless of that, and you won't get fired on it later on our side of the house. The second thing I want you to notice here is, when was the last time that anti-discrimination laws have worked for a woman who was just recently married? Never. You haven't heard this happen recently or practically ever. I don't think this is very, very effective in the first place. But the second thing they say on practical is, what if you want to have kids later and you won't be able to renegotiate? All of this is assertion, because you have the ability to renegotiate contracts every 2 to 3 years to 4 years to 5 years. You can renegotiate it whenever you want to, when that contract ends. Contracts do have to end, they do have to be reevaluated. This is just an empirical lie. They say, what if you find your soulmate? I found my soulmate, I'm going to go get pregnant with him in the next year or so. I'm probably going to wait to build a family, guys. It's just unrealistic. I'm going to wait 2 years until my contract is over to have a child. Sure, it's not that big of a deal. The third thing they say on practical, actually that's it. They don't say anything else on practical. It's just principle and rhetoric. What do we tell you at proposition then? A few things. Number one, that people should be allowed to make themselves attractive hires. And we do this all the time. So if a rich person goes to a prestigious university that allows them to get into a job, we allow them to do that at the cost of a poorer person who wasn't able to go to the university, and we allow that to be acceptable. We don't think that you shouldn't get hired because, oh, you came at the cost of somebody else who could have also been there. We do this all the time, a frame that they don't engage with. The second thing we say is that more women just get hired, and the only response that they have to this is at reply, and they say, hey, you know what, it doesn't really matter, because what about the women who want to have children? We told you why this is far more important, because A, these are far more in scale, but more importantly, thirdly, we told you that money is just more important than having kids. And the only thing they have to weigh this out is, oh, what if you see the eyes of your daughter and you're really, really emotional about it? No, most people don't get that sort of fulfillment all the time from kids. You need money for survival, but more importantly, what if you see the crying eyes of your daughter when you can't pay for her to go to school because you didn't have a stable job in the first place? The prerequisite to having a child who has beautiful eyes is being able to pay for giving birth in the first place, something that they don't engage with. The third thing we told you is it's a counter narrative in developing nations. In the third world, where people pressurize you to have kids earlier and earlier, when you have a formal counter narrative that propagates you to not want to have kids earlier, you have the ability to have more autonomy because you have two choices, two counter narratives that you can buy into. Notice then that any harm that opposition has left standing is absorbed by the fact that money is the thing that gives you power. It is a prerequisite to having a nice family. So even if you have a family, the ability to pay for anything, to enjoy a stress-free life, is to have money and the identity that comes with it. Give it to Pakistan.